There is a moment when you notice the room grows quieter around you, not out of respect, but withdrawal. Conversations shorten, eyes drift past you, the silence feels personal, and pride wants to call it injustice. But distance is rarely random. It is feedback disguised as absence. When people ignore you, it is not always rejection. Often, it is a mirror, and if you're willing to look at it, the pattern reveals itself. Lesson 1. When people ignore you, it is rarely about silence itself. It is about the weight you place in the room without noticing it. The title points to a reality most men resist admitting. This pushes people away, not with aggression, not with cruelty, but with the quiet gravity of superiority that never needs to be declared aloud. You do not say you are above others. You signal it. And time has already proven what happens when a man treats every interaction as a stage instead of a conversation. There is a pattern here. You speak to assert rather than connect. You correct instead of understand. You wait for your turn to respond instead of listening to what was actually said. The words may sound calm, but the message beneath them is simple. You have already decided you are right. Who willingly opens themselves to someone who has already closed the door? Who chooses to stay near a man who treats every discussion as a test of competence, not a moment of presence? People do not confront this directly. They withdraw. They conserve their energy. They choose distance instead of collision. The irony is that this behavior rarely begins from arrogance. It begins from insecurity disguised as certainty. You worked hard to become competent, disciplined, controlled. You fear irrelevance, so you compensate with refinement. But competence without humility hardens into quiet dismissal. You may not mock others, yet you carry an invisible hierarchy in your tone. You compare. You evaluate. You speak as if life has appointed you the final interpreter of reality. Ask yourself something honest. Do you speak to share, or do you speak to dominate? Do you engage to understand, or to reinforce your image of being the man who already figured it out? There is a difference between strength and superiority. Strength is grounded. It does not need to announce itself. Superiority is fragile. It constantly searches for proof, and people sense the difference before a single word is spoken. They feel when they are being measured. They feel when they are not being met as equals. They retreat, not out of weakness, but out of self-preservation. One anchor sentence lives here. Silence is not rejection. It is refusal to participate in your performance. This is why the room grows distant, not because others lack depth, not because they envy you, but because presence becomes exhausting when every exchange must orbit your certainty. You may call it isolation. They call it relief. You may think they misjudge you. They think you never truly saw them. Ignoring you becomes the simplest form of resistance, and when you notice it, the tension is not a curse. It is evidence. It is the world reflecting back the posture you carry into it. If you strip away defensiveness, the pattern becomes impossible to deny. The more you center yourself, the more others drift. The more you assert control, the less they offer themselves. And as the distance grows, you tell yourself you are misunderstood. But beneath that explanation is a quieter truth you already feel, though you refuse to name it. Lesson 2. If people ignore you, it is often because every interaction slowly turns into a performance built around your emotions, even when you believe you are being controlled. The title exposes the truth you would rather avoid admitting. This pushes people away, not through outbursts alone, but through the constant tension others feel when they must manage your internal weather before they can speak freely. Presence becomes supervision. Conversation becomes restraint, and history has already shown what happens when people grow tired of guarding themselves around someone who refuses to guard himself. You tell yourself you are calm, You tell yourself you are composed, yet beneath the surface, every disagreement becomes a test of loyalty. Every silence becomes an accusation. Every neutral moment becomes a stage for unspoken expectations. Others sense it. They adjust their tone, their words, their honesty, just to avoid stepping on unseen glass. Ask yourself something direct. When someone speaks to you, do they relax or do they calculate? Do they open or do they tread carefully? The answer reveals more about you than their behavior ever will. Emotional volatility does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through tension. It appears in the sigh that carries meaning, in the pause that feels like pressure, in the subtle shift of expression that tells people they have said the wrong thing even when no rule was spoken. You call it sensitivity. They experience it as exhaustion, not because they dislike you, but because they must constantly stay alert. And a life lived in alertness eventually searches for distance. Ignoring you becomes easier than negotiating your reactions. This pattern rarely begins with malice. It begins with unresolved expectations you refuse to name. You want acknowledgement without asking for it. You want understanding without revealing yourself. You want closeness without risking vulnerability. So emotions leak instead of being owned. They appear as coldness, withdrawal, or quiet punishment. People do not argue with it. They step back. They retreat one conversation at a time until one day all that remains is politeness without presence. One anchor sentence lives here. Distance is not betrayal. It is self-defense against your unspoken demands. Consider the way you hold silence, not as discipline, but as pressure. You withdraw to signal disappointment. You pause to create unease. You believe you are being restrained. Others feel they are being corrected. Over time, they stop sharing their thoughts. They stop revealing their flaws. They stop bringing their real selves near you. Not because they fear truth, but because your reactions make truth unsafe. Ignoring you is not aggression. It is escape from the weight of anticipation. The uncomfortable truth is this: the more you insist you are calm, the more others sense the effort behind it. And effort always leaks. Real steadiness does not demand accommodation. It does not require others to tiptoe. It does not ask people to protect themselves from you. When people begin to disappear from your life without confrontation, it is rarely sudden. It is accumulation. Every small tension, every guarded word, every moment where presence had to yield to your emotional gravity. They leave quietly because they learned that staying requires constant caution, and caution is not a place where anyone chooses to remain. Lesson 3. If people ignore you, it is often because every conversation slowly becomes a competition you never admit you're playing. The title names the reality you do not enjoy confronting. This pushes people away, not through open hostility, but through the quiet fatigue of being measured, compared, and subtly overruled in every exchange. You do not shout others down. You out-explain them. You out-interpret them. You turn dialogue into demonstration, and time has already proven what happens when a man treats human connection as a proving ground instead of a place to meet another mind. Notice the pattern in the way you speak. Someone shares an experience, and instead of entering it, you elevate above it. They express uncertainty, and instead of understanding, you refine their perspective. You do not say, "I am better." You imply, "I am beyond this." Ask yourself honestly, when others speak, do you allow their words to stand, or do you feel compelled to improve them? Do you listen to discover or to correct the imperfections you believe you see? People sense this. They recognize when their story is no longer theirs, but raw material for your commentary. Competition does not always appear as arrogance. Sometimes it masks itself as precision. You believe you are being helpful, insightful, efficient. But beneath that efficiency lives an unspoken message. Your experience is insufficient unless filtered through my understanding. Over time, people stop offering depth because depth becomes ammunition. They shrink their vulnerability because vulnerability becomes something you polish instead of respect. They do not argue, they withdraw. They choose silence because silence cannot be edited. There is a quiet insecurity beneath this need to refine everything. You fear irrelevance, so you reach for mastery in every exchange. You fear being unseen, so you demonstrate competence before connection. But mastery without restraint turns intimacy into discomfort. People do not want to prove themselves around you. They want to exist without being evaluated. One anchor sentence lives here. Presence is not a stage. It is a place where comparison has nothing to prove. Consider the small moments. Someone speaks about their struggle, and instead of sitting with them, you introduce your method, your framework, your clarity. Someone reflects on a mistake, and you respond with a subtle improvement to their conclusion. You call it contribution. They feel erased inside their own experience. They learn that speaking to you means surrendering ownership of their thoughts. So they stop offering anything that matters, not because they lack depth, but because you do not allow depth to remain theirs. This is why rooms grow quieter when you enter, not from intimidation, but from resignation. People conserve themselves. They share less, reveal less, think less aloud, because your presence converts conversation into evaluation. They do not compete. They leave the arena you keep building. And as they drift away, you tell yourself they are uninterested, distracted, undisciplined. But beneath that explanation is a truth you feel when the silence settles, a truth you resist naming even as it stands in front of you. Lesson 4. If people ignore you, it is often because your presence carries a quiet neediness you refuse to acknowledge, even while convincing yourself that you are independent. The title speaks with precision. This pushes people away, not through desperation expressed aloud, but through the subtle gravity of someone who treats every interaction as an unspoken request for reassurance, validation, or significance. You do not ask directly. You hover. You linger. You remain present long after the moment has ended because you are not seeking connection. You are seeking confirmation that you still matter. This need does not announce itself with loud words. It reveals itself in tone, posture, timing. You speak with expectation rather than presence. You wait for reactions instead of allowing silence to exist. Every message, every gesture, every interruption carries a subtext. Acknowledge me, affirm me, notice me. Others sense it. They may not interpret it logically, but they feel the pull beneath the conversation. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. When you are with others, do you rest in the moment, or do you search for proof that you belong there? Does your presence stand on its own, or does it depend on their response to you? Neediness is not weakness. It is dependence disguised as connection. It appears when you treat relationships as supply rather than exchange. You speak about discipline, strength, self-control, yet your identity leans quietly against the approval of others. You do not say this aloud. You would never frame yourself as dependent. But the subtle tension emerges when your sense of worth shifts with every reaction, every response, time, every tone, change you notice. They do not feel free around you because your presence turns their reactions into responsibilities. Over time, this transforms the atmosphere. People begin to conserve themselves around you. They speak less truth. They limit their presence. They choose distance not from anger, but from fatigue. They are not rejecting you. They are escaping the pressure of being the emotional anchor you refuse to become for yourself. One anchor sentence lives here. Attention is not connection. It is a substitute you keep mistaking for presence. Notice the patterns you avoid naming. You replay conversations long after they end. You search for hidden meaning in neutral silence. You interpret delayed responses as disrespect instead of normal life, continuing without you at the center of it. The world does not orbit your expectations, yet you react as if it should. This reaction is not entitlement. It is fear. Fear of being invisible, irrelevant, replaceable. Instead of confronting that fear, you project it into the room, and people feel the quiet weight of carrying a role they never agreed to hold. This is why withdrawal often surprises you. You believe you offered loyalty, availability, presence. You do not see the invisible cost attached to those gestures. To you, they look like commitment. To others, they feel like obligation. They step back because remaining near you requires constant emotional investment, and investment without freedom eventually becomes burden. They do not confront you about it. They choose silence, because silence is easier than naming a truth you are not ready to hear. And when the distance forms, you call it immaturity, avoidance, superficiality. But beneath every explanation, there is a quiet recognition you cannot dismiss forever, because somewhere inside, you already know why rooms grow lighter when you are no longer in them, even if you refuse to say it aloud. Lesson 5. If people ignore you, it is often because you withhold vulnerability while still demanding recognition, creating a tension others cannot resolve. The title states the consequence with clarity. This pushes people away. You present strength, restraint, composure, but never the parts of yourself that bleed, doubt, or fracture. You want to be seen, yet you refuse to be known. And time has already shown what happens when a man asks others to meet him deeply while never stepping forward himself. You speak with conviction. You carry yourself with discipline. You reveal opinions, conclusions, insights, but not fears, not uncertainty, not pain. People sense the imbalance. They feel as though they are standing in front of a closed door while being asked to knock louder. Ask yourself directly, when was the last time you exposed something fragile without disguising it as wisdom? When did you last admit confusion instead of disguising it as reflection? You may believe you are protecting dignity. Others experience it as distance. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is proof of presence. When you refuse to reveal anything human beneath your composure, you place others in a silent conflict. They can either match your emotional restraint or risk appearing smaller than you. Most will choose withdrawal. They will not compete for closeness with someone who refuses to step off the pedestal he built for himself. And so, conversations become formal. Interactions become polished. The air grows colder, not because they lack warmth, but because your guardedness leaves no room for it. You tell yourself you are private, self-contained, disciplined, but privacy becomes armor when it never opens. Containment becomes isolation when it never softens. Discipline becomes a wall when it never bends. You demand honesty from others while offering only abstraction in return. One anchor sentence lives here. Connection cannot grow where truth has no permission to exist. Consider the moments where you deflect instead of reveal. Someone shares their struggle, and instead of responding with your own humanity, you respond with analysis. Someone admits fear, and you respond with perspective. You believe you are being helpful. They feel alone in your presence. Not because you lack empathy, but because empathy without vulnerability becomes distance masquerading as support. Over time, they stop offering depth. They stop bringing their real selves to you. They stop trusting the space between you because the space never becomes mutual. There is a deeper truth beneath this resistance to vulnerability. You fear losing control of the image you built. You fear that once you open even slightly, the illusion of certainty will fracture. So you remain guarded, composed, untouched. But an untouched man cannot be reached. And a man who cannot be reached eventually finds himself alone, not because others abandoned him, but because he refused to step into the same emotional room. People do not ignore you out of cruelty. They ignore you because interaction with you becomes one-sided. They reveal themselves and receive a mask in return. They tire of speaking into distance. They grow weary of offering sincerity to a surface that never reflects anything back. They stop insisting. They stop trying. They drift, quietly, gradually, until one day you mistake their silence for disinterest, when in truth, it is the natural consequence of a connection that never had a place to breathe. Lesson 6. If people ignore you, it is often because you turn correction into a habit, even when no one asked to be corrected. The title exposes the consequence you would rather deny. This pushes people away, not through open confrontation, but through the subtle erosion that happens when every interaction becomes an opportunity to refine, adjust, or improve the other person. You believe you are offering clarity. They experience it as surveillance. And history has already revealed what unfolds when a man confuses dominance of detail with depth of understanding. You tell yourself you value truth. You tell yourself precision matters. Yet, beneath that justification lives a quieter impulse, the need to shape the world so it never challenges your internal order. You correct grammar instead of receiving meaning. You interrupt stories to repair timelines. You adjust opinions before they finish forming. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. When someone speaks to you, do you allow imperfection to exist? Or do you feel compelled to fix it before the moment can breathe? Do you let people finish their thoughts? Or do you reshape them to fit your comfort? Correction rarely arrives alone. It carries posture, tone, timing. It tells people, gently but repeatedly, that they are slightly misaligned, slightly uninformed, slightly behind you. You may not raise your voice, you may not humiliate anyone, but the message persists. You see yourself as the standard. Over time, people stop bringing you their unpolished thoughts because raw humanity does not survive under constant adjustment. They speak less freely. They share fewer beginnings. They choose silence because silence cannot be corrected. You believe this habit proves competence. In truth, it reveals fear, fear of disorder, fear of uncertainty, fear of being wrong in public space. Rather than sit inside ambiguity, you tidy it. Rather than witness a flawed expression, you refine it. But closeness is built through tolerance, not control. One anchor sentence lives here. Understanding does not always need improvement. Consider the environments you create without realizing it. A coworker hesitates before speaking because they know you will dissect their phrasing. A friend edits their story mid-sentence because they expect interruption. A partner grows cautious, measuring every word, not because they fear truth, but because truth with you must always survive inspection. You call this honesty. They experience it as fatigue. No one wants to live inside perpetual evaluation, masquerading as conversation. There is another dimension to this pattern. Correction becomes a shield. As long as you are refining others, you do not have to expose yourself. As long as you are identifying their flaws, your own remain untouched. You remain the observer, never the subject. You remain the authority, never the participant. This preserves your image, but it destroys connection. People do not withdraw because they lack resilience. They withdraw because relationships cannot thrive under constant oversight. Notice what happens as distance grows. You interpret withdrawal as weakness. You interpret silence as disinterest. You tell yourself others simply cannot handle honesty. But beneath that narrative is a discomfort you refuse to examine. The realization that your presence does not create safety. It creates tension disguised as intellect, and tension, sustained long enough, forces people to choose between authenticity and proximity. Most will choose authenticity. They will choose themselves. When the room grows quiet around you, it is not always rejection. Sometimes it is relief from the weight you place on every word spoken in your presence. And if you listen closely, you will hear what the silence has been trying to tell you long before anyone disappeared. Lesson 7. If people ignore you, it is often because you use silence not as discipline, but as punishment, and the atmosphere around you hardens in response. The title exposes the dynamic you rarely admit aloud. This pushes people away. You withdraw, you pause, you withhold speech, not to preserve composure, but to signal disapproval, disappointment, or control. You call it restraint. Others feel it as pressure. And time has already shown what happens when a man confuses emotional distance with strength. You convince yourself that saying nothing is the higher road. You tell yourself you are preventing conflict, choosing maturity, refusing escalation. But beneath that narrative lives intention. You want them to notice. You want them to feel the weight of your absence. You want the room to bend around your silence until someone steps forward to restore your comfort for you. Ask yourself with honesty, when you go quiet, are you mastering yourself? Or are you manipulating the environment to answer your unspoken demand? People sense the difference immediately. Real discipline creates calm. Punitive silence creates tension. Words no longer flow. Movements become careful. The air thickens with questions no one is allowed to ask. They wonder what rule they violated, what expectation they failed, what invisible boundary they crossed. Yet instead of clarity, you offer distance. Instead of communication, you offer withdrawal. Over time, interaction with you begins to feel like walking through a corridor of unspoken consequences. You may not raise your voice, yet your silence holds the same force as anger. A glance withheld becomes correction. A pause becomes judgment. A conversation ends abruptly, and the message is unmistakable even without a single word. You believe this proves control. They experience it as emotional coldness. One anchor sentence lives here. Silence that seeks obedience is not restraint. It is pressure. Consider the relationships where this pattern lives. A friend shares something imperfect, and you respond by retreating into stillness instead of engagement. A partner expresses concern, and instead of presence, you vanish emotionally while remaining physically near. A colleague makes a mistake, and your refusal to speak becomes a verdict. No confrontation, no dialogue, only distance used as leverage. They do not challenge it. They adapt. Then they detach. Punitive silence teaches people one lesson. Vulnerability is unsafe near you. If honesty leads to withdrawal, they will avoid honesty. If imperfection leads to emotional exile, they will hide their imperfection. Eventually, interaction with you ceases to feel human at all. It becomes tactical, filtered, guarded. You say very little, but your absence speaks loudly enough to empty the room of authenticity. This behavior does not emerge from strength. It emerges from fear. Fear of being exposed in conflict, fear of losing control in open dialogue, fear of saying something that reveals more than you intend. Silence becomes your armor, but armor repels more than it protects. Over time, the same mechanism you use to avoid discomfort becomes the mechanism that empties your relationships. When distance begins to appear, you frame it as immaturity in others. You say they avoid confrontation. You say they cannot handle intensity. But the truth rests in the pattern. The more you use silence to force understanding, the less people choose to remain near you. They are not resisting you. They are escaping a space where communication is replaced by punishment disguised as composure. Lesson 8. If people ignore you, it is often because your identity quietly depends on being noticed, and people feel the gravity of that need even when you never speak it aloud. The title names the consequence without exaggeration. This pushes people away. Your worth rises when eyes turn toward you and falls when they drift elsewhere. You do not ask for attention directly. You simply orient your presence so that everything around you must acknowledge it. And time has already proven what happens when a man builds himself on recognition instead of grounding. Notice the subtle ways this appears. You tell a story, but the story is not about the event. It is about your role within it. You offer insight, but the insight circles back to your discipline, your clarity, your endurance. You listen, yet the conversation eventually returns to you as its final reference point. Ask yourself something difficult. If no one responded to you, would you still feel like the same man in the room? Or do you search for small confirmations that you still occupy the center? Attention becomes a quiet currency. You do not crave applause, but you crave acknowledgement. A delayed reply unsettles you. A neutral tone feels like disregard. A conversation that moves on without your voice leaves you restless. You interpret these moments as disrespect, but beneath the reaction lives dependency. You are not grounded in who you are. You are grounded in how you are perceived, and people sense that burden, even when they cannot name it. This dependence does not create closeness. It creates pressure. Others begin to feel responsible for your stability. Their presence becomes service. Their engagement becomes proof. Over time, they grow cautious, because every interaction carries unspoken obligation. Do not let him feel unseen. They do not confront this dynamic. They withdraw from it. One anchor sentence lives here. Recognition is fragile ground for a man to stand on. Consider the quiet behaviors that reinforce the pattern. You linger in conversations after their natural ending, stretching the moment so that your relevance does not dissolve. You insert yourself into discussions not because you have something necessary to add, but because silence would make you feel invisible. You replay interactions in your mind, searching for signs that you were valued enough, noticed enough, affirmed enough. None of this appears aggressive, yet all of it places weight on the people around you. They begin to limit proximity. Not because they dislike you, but because they cannot remain the mirror you insist on standing in front of. They want to relate to you, not sustain you. They want presence without expectation. But expectation lives inside every exchange you enter. So they drift. They preserve themselves. They choose environments where attention is shared instead of owed. This pattern rarely begins with vanity. It begins with a fracture you never addressed, the fear that without recognition, you might disappear. Instead of facing that fear, you turn others into evidence. You seek proof of existence through their gaze, yet proof borrowed from the outside always demands renewal. And renewal, sustained long enough, becomes exhaustion for everyone involved. When they finally step back, you call it disloyalty, indifference, immaturity. You tell yourself they could not appreciate your depth, your discipline, your presence. But beneath every explanation, something quieter remains. The recognition that your identity was never resting on solid ground, and the distance you now feel is not rejection. It is the natural response to a life built on constant validation rather than inner weight. Lesson 9. If people ignore you, it is often because you speak far more than you listen, and people eventually stop offering themselves to someone who does not leave room for them to exist. The title points to the consequence you keep encountering, but rarely trace back to its source. This pushes people away. Not through aggression, not through cruelty, but through the quiet suffocation that happens when every conversation bends toward your voice, your perspective, your conclusions. You do not shout. You occupy the space until no one else fits inside it. Notice the rhythm of your interactions. Someone begins to share, and before their thought has shape, you fill the silence with your interpretation. You interrupt gently, believing you are adding value. You finish sentences that were never yours to complete. You believe presence means contribution, but presence often means restraint. Ask yourself with honesty, when another person speaks, do you wait to truly hear them? Or do you wait for your turn to return to the center? Do you receive their world, or do you replace it with your own the moment it arrives? People do not disappear from you all at once. They withdraw gradually. First, they shorten their stories. Then, they avoid deeper subjects. Eventually, they offer only fragments, because fragments are all that survive beside someone who never pauses long enough to witness a full thought. They do not confront you about this. They adapt. They learn that your conversations are not places where they are discovered, but places where they are edited out of themselves. One anchor sentence lives here. Listening is not silence. It is respect in motion. You tell yourself you are engaged, invested, attentive, and in your mind you are. But engagement without listening becomes performance. You are present physically while remaining mentally centered on what you will say next. You respond quickly instead of slowly. You analyze instead of absorbing. You treat words as material to work with rather than experiences being entrusted to you. Over time, people sense that they are not being heard, they are being processed. And no one longs to stay where their inner life becomes another object for someone else's interpretation. Consider the moments you rarely examine. A friend pauses to find language, and rather than wait, you supply it. A colleague explains a struggle, and instead of letting the wait settle, you immediately draw a conclusion. A partner begins to reveal something vulnerable, and you respond with insight instead of attention. You believe you are helping. They feel unseen inside their own story, so they step back. They conserve themselves. They choose environments where their words are not rushed into resolution. This pattern does not arise from malice. It grows from discomfort with spaces you cannot control. Silence unsettles you, so you fill it. Unfinished thoughts create tension, so you complete them. But connection requires patience with what is not yet formed. It demands the discipline to stand beside another person's uncertainty without needing to sculpt it into your comfort. When you refuse that discipline, you do not simply dominate the conversation. You erase the person speaking through it. And when they finally drift away, you tell yourself they lack depth, initiative, or courage. Yet, beneath those explanations lies a truth that does not leave you, even when others do. Distance formed not because they had nothing to say, but because there was no space left in you for their voice to live. Lesson 10. If people ignore you, it is often because your sense of self has drifted away from grounding and attached itself to perception, and others quietly withdraw from the weight of sustaining the image you present. The title states the consequence without decoration. This pushes people away. Not because you are unworthy of connection, but because connection cannot survive where identity is constantly managed, curated, and reinforced rather than lived. You do not realize it, yet every room becomes a stage where you maintain who you believe you must be, instead of simply being who you are when no one is watching. This dependence on perception does not show itself through arrogance. It reveals itself through tension. You move carefully, speak carefully, present carefully, as if every action must protect a version of yourself that cannot afford to fracture. You confuse composure with identity. You confuse discipline with essence. Ask yourself something honest. If recognition disappeared, would you still recognize the man who remains? Or have you built your reflection so carefully that without witnesses, you do not know where you end and performance begins? People sense this, not through logic, but through atmosphere. They feel that conversations are not simply moments, but confirmations. They feel that presence is not exchange, but reinforcement. Every interaction becomes part of a narrative you are trying to sustain about yourself. You do not ask them to admire you, but you ask them silently to participate in your stability. Over time, that request becomes exhausting. One anchor sentence lives here. A man who must be seen cannot truly be with anyone. Consider how this appears in ordinary life. You speak about your achievements not as memories, but as proof. You highlight discipline not as practice, but as identity. You hold opinions not as perspectives, but as pillars that cannot be questioned without shaking the ground beneath you. Others do not challenge you, not because they agree, but because they sense how fragile your self-image is beneath the exterior of control. They reduce honesty, they limit depth, they remain polite, because authenticity around you feels dangerous. Isolation grows quietly in this environment, not as abandonment, but as distance created by self-protection on both sides. You protect your image. They protect themselves from being drawn into it. Slowly, interaction becomes thinner, colder, more formal. You tell yourself people changed. You tell yourself society is superficial, unreliable, disloyal. But the deeper truth is simpler. No one can remain close to a man who is never fully present, because presence requires a self that does not need constant reinforcement to exist. This pattern does not emerge from vanity. It emerges from fear. The fear that if you stop performing strength, you may discover weakness. If you stop projecting certainty, you may encounter doubt. If you stop constructing identity, you may face the quiet question of who you are without external confirmation. Instead of confronting that question, you outsource its answer to the reactions of others. But borrowed identity always fractures, and fracture always creates distance. So people retreat, not loudly, not dramatically. They drift toward places where they are allowed to exist without contributing to someone else's narrative. They choose relationships where presence is shared instead of preserved like a fragile object. They do not ignore you out of rejection. They step back because closeness requires reality, and reality cannot enter a life lived as performance. And somewhere, in the silence that remains, you already feel the truth pressing against the edges of the image you have spent so long holding in place. If this message confronted you, stay. Subscribe and remain here with the kind of men who choose awareness over comfort. And if something in this spoke to you, write it in the comments. Not for attention, for clarity.